So welcome everyone to the latest in a series of the development and support webinars delivered by the NIHR Academy. My name is Martine Scannell and I work in the NIHR Academy as the Development and Support Manager. This webinar, Intro into Knowledge and Mobilisation for Researchers, is in collaboration between NIHR Academy and NIHR Centre for Engagement and Dissemination. The Centre for Engagement and Dissemination was launched in April in 2020 to support the dissemination and mobilisation of NIHR-funded research. This webinar is facilitated by Lindsay Bearne and Helen Baxter, both Senior Research Fellows in Knowledge Mobilisation at CED. Alongside their roles at CED, Lindsay is a physiotherapist and a rehabilitation researcher at Kingston University and St George's University. And Helen is an NIHR Knowledge Mobilisation Fellow at the Centre for Academic Primary Care at the University of Bristol. So Lindsay, I'm now going to hand over to you.
So thank you ever so much, Martine, and welcome to everybody for joining us today. So this webinar is really focused on helping researchers with little experience of knowledge mobilisation, but who are interested in thinking about how to optimise the impact of their research. So during this webinar, we will introduce you to the concept of knowledge mobilisation and highlight why it's important for researchers to understand and incorporate specific strategies into their research programmes. Ideally, knowledge mobilisation should be considered at the outset of a research programme. However, we are aware that many of you on the call will have already started your project, but don't worry, it's not too late to incorporate knowledge mobilisation strategies into your programme because these can be embedded throughout the research cycle. Because this is an introductory session, we'll also signpost you to some additional resources that can help you as you become more familiar with knowledge mobilisation approaches. So what's the problem that we're trying to address? Whilst evidence-based practice and policy may seem a central part of work of all practitioners and policymakers, in fact, even when evidence is available to inform our work, it's not always adhered to, and this can lead to the delivery of suboptimal services. One of the challenges that needs to be addressed to overcome this evidence to practice or policy gap is the time it takes for the research process to complete. We're all aware of the steps that comprise the research process shown on the screen, from identification of research priorities to obtaining research funding, completing the research and publishing our findings. But after this, research syntheses and guidelines development are often required if it's to be adopted into practice or recommended for adoption into practice. However, even if the development of practice guidelines are completed in a timely manner, this doesn't necessarily mean that the recommendations will be implemented. And there are a plethora of studies and reviews that describe some of the barriers that influence the adoption of guidelines by clinicians and also other people who require these evidence-based guidelines to support their work. Suffice it to say that it can take a long time, and some authors quote up to 17 years to get evidence embedded into routine practice, although this is contested. And rather alarmingly, as little as 14% of health research becomes standard of care. So this matters because it impacts on patient outcomes, and research by Grohl, Schuster and Braithwaite and others suggest that up to 40% of patients do not get treated with the best, using the best evidence. Over a quarter get care that is either not needed or is harmful, and up to 75% do not get enough information to help them make informed health decisions. And I think it's incumbent on us all to try and do better. So knowledge mobilisation is one approach that could help researchers like yourself share their work with research users. In this area, there are lots of different terms used, including knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, knowledge translation, or pathway to impact. But in health and social care, knowledge mobilisation is the commonly used term. And this can be defined as the sharing of knowledge between different communities to catalyse change. So it's a two-way process. It includes elements of researchers pushing out research or disseminating their research findings, research users actively seeking out health research, and the co-production or co-creation of knowledge. Because there are lots of terms often used interchangeably, it's important to understand that it is more than dissemination. And we felt it was important to clarify some of the distinctions between knowledge mobilisation, dissemination, and impact. So dissemination is a one-way process, and this is defined as where research findings are provided to a specific audience via targeted channels using planned strategies. And examples include presenting at conferences or patient forums, or writing blogs for specialist websites. It's also important not to confuse knowledge mobilisation with impact. Impact is the demonstrable contribution that research makes to society and the economy, and of benefit to individuals, organisations and nations. And in fact, impact could be regarded as the outcome of dissemination and knowledge mobilisation. And this is why the term pathway to impact is sometimes used. Before we go any further, we'd like to find out if you are using knowledge mobilisation approaches or knowledge mobilisation strategies in your research. And we'd now like to launch a poll for you to respond to. And the poll is, are you using any knowledge mobilisation approaches in your research now? Okay, great. So we'll just leave that open for a few more seconds. Okay, thank you very much. So if we could end the poll and share the results, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Helen Baxter.
Good afternoon, everyone. So the reports from the poll, 39% of you said yes, 24% have said no, and 37% aren't quite sure. Lovely. So thank you very much for that. So as some of you will be aware, there are a range of theories, frameworks, and models that have been developed to address the research practice gap. Implementation science is closely related to knowledge mobilisation, although there are some differences. However, most individuals working in the area of knowledge mobilisation also draw on the learning from implementation science and its theories to inform how best to mobilise knowledge. As this presentation is focused on knowledge mobilisation, we're going to highlight the core theories used in the knowledge mobilisation area. And if you look on the diagram produced by Nielsen in 2015, this gives a nice overview of the learning across implementation science and knowledge mobilisation. And you can see the key knowledge mobilisation theories in the middle at the bottom. And these are the classic theories. And these originate from many other fields, from education, psychology, and sociology, amongst others. So today we've selected 3 to talk about in this webinar that we feel really get to the roots of knowledge mobilisation, what it's all about. But for your research, it's important you select the one that's right for the aims of your project and the communities that you're working with. So this brief overview of the 3 classic knowledge mobilisation theories, these basically inform us on 3 things: how people approach new things, how they learn, and how they share knowledge. So to start off with, a very well-known theory from the area of business and management is the diffusion of innovation. And this theory is interesting to us because it deals with how people respond to new things. And this could be your research. And most importantly, it highlights that people respond quite differently. So there's three key elements to this theory that you can see on the diagram. The first thing to consider is the characteristics or pros and cons of the innovation or new thing. And what does it actually offer? Because for something to gain traction in an area, it has to have a clearly identified set of attributes that people can easily recognize. And when you're talking about your research, your new thing, this is really something to bear in mind. Secondly, the characteristics of the adopters of the innovation that you can see there and their social influence. So as you can see from the diagram, 50% people are essentially late adopters. And the early adopters are quite a small percentage, and the innovators are even smaller still. And what this theory explains is those early adopters and innovators are really essential to getting the ideas out there. So these are the champions. And so the work around how champions work and operate, and you may have seen it in action, is a very important consideration in how to get new ideas and innovations out into the wider field. And finally, it's important to consider the social context, the larger political context and the larger social area. So this would be the salience of the issues related to this innovation, the meaning and how it's reframed, and quite importantly, the timing of when it's introduced. So a good example of this is the current research into COVID, which of course has been adopted into practice very, very quickly, because it's very much of the time. It's very much what we need at the moment. And of course, it's all very salient due to the pandemic. If you're interested in this area, Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point is a really easy read on this and its real world application. The next theory I'm going to talk about is how people learn new things. So Kolb's learning theory highlights how we learn essentially in a 4-stage cycle. However, he points out that we often do it in quite different ways. In the diagram, you'll see that the 4 stages of the learning cycle. We all use the 4 in some way or another, but we usually have 2 strong preferences for 2 stages. Another way of thinking about these stages is to think about learning by doing, learning by thinking, learning by watching, and learning by feeling. So for example, some people like to watch a new technique or an idea and they have a little think about it afterwards and ponder. Others like to pitch in and have a go, and that's how they learn best. One of the key elements of this theory of interest to knowledge mobilizers is that it recognizes the tacit nature of acquiring knowledge through learning by doing. Sometimes we're not even aware of what we're learning or the acquisition of new knowledge as it occurs at subconscious level. An area of knowledge mobilization that's explored this idea of tacit knowledge and learning by doing is that of collective making. And this is being done by Joe Langley and colleagues at Sheffield Hallam University. Based on the principles of co-design, in collective making, participants are asked to both make a model or a design and talk through their thought processes and the meaning of the design for them. In this way, the method attempts to surface the tacit knowledge and unconscious thoughts and the knowledge of the maker. And this method has been used successfully to tap into the explicit and tacit knowledge of patients and clinicians to inform the design of several medical devices. The final theory I'm going to talk about today is widely used in knowledge mobilization, and this is the theory of the community of practice. And this theory looks at how knowledge is shared. The key element of this theory is that the sharing of knowledge happens most successfully through social interaction. And this theory comes from the education literature and was first described by Wenger. Wenger and colleagues describe how communities of practice are groups of people who share an interest in a common topic, who come together to build a body of knowledge. On the slide, you can see the key components of community of practice. But the tricky thing is they normally occur naturally, born out of shared interests and pursuits. In organizations, attempts have been made to build communities of practice from scratch, but they've not always been successful. A very well-known example of a community of practice was found by Gabet and LeMay, who discovered a group of general practitioners who were sharing their knowledge for their clinical practice in a naturally forming community of practice. As a result of this knowledge sharing, the authors described a formation of what they called mind lines. These mind lines were described as internalized, collectively reinforced, partially tacit guidelines in the head that clinicians use to guide their practice. And this gave the clinicians efficient and elegant thinking for complex problems. These were broader than heuristics and gave flexibility, practicality, and a contextual relevance to the clinician's thinking. One example of how knowledge has been mobilised through the formation of mind lines is in the work of Kate Beckett, who's used form and theatre as a strategy to influence mind lines. Kate works in the area of post-injury psychological problems, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Here she is talking about the concept of mind lines and how it's informed her work.
So I'm going to tell you about my Knowledge Mobilisation Research Fellowship project, which was called, it's quite a long name, it's called the Enhancing Post-Injury Psychological Intervention and Care Study, or EPIC. It was a collaboration between patients, practitioners, researchers, and theatre practitioners. What it aimed to do was to mobilise knowledge about the psychological impact of injury and how relatively common post-injury psychological problems such as PTSD impact on the extent and duration of recovery and on NHS individual and societal costs. Like many topics, there's extensive evidence about this issue, but it's had little impact on practice. So what we did in my project was we developed and tested a new KM approach based on knowledge mobilisation, mind lines, and forum theatre principles. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about them. So mind lines are the brainchild of two leading KM experts. They're called André Lemay and John Gabay, who back in 2004 reframed the knowledge mobilisation question from how can we improve the uptake of scientific evidence to what types of evidence are needed for effective healthcare and how is it learned, modified and transmitted. So just reframing the knowledge mobilisation problem.
And now Kate will explain a little bit more about forum theatre.
In forum theatre, a play is devised to represent diverse stories about an issue which needs to change, i.e. one in which the key protagonists' outcomes are poor. The play is performed in front of audiences of the same stakeholder groups who contributed those stories to stimulate debate and knowledge sharing. The play is then re-performed, only this time the audience are invited to step onto the stage and take the place of one of the actors and to try out new solutions. The remaining forum theatre actors improvise what the impact of this intervention is and any unforeseen consequences. So forum theatre therefore uses similar mechanisms to mobilise knowledge as mind lines.
Okay, so Kate's just presented there a very innovative approach to knowledge mobilisation. But let's start to look how you might start thinking about your own research and how you could introduce knowledge mobilisation approaches in a useful way. Most importantly, knowledge mobilisation can be incorporated into all stages of the research cycle and at any stage. However, the earlier in the research cycle you begin to think about it and adopt knowledge mobilisation principles, the easier and more beneficial it will be for you and your users. I guess the most important message here is it's really never too late. So using knowledge mobilisation techniques and strategies throughout the research cycle can really assist you in shaping your research to the needs of your users. However, as you can see on the slide, this may require some degree of flexibility and maybe a little rethinking, as you can see on the diagram on the slide. One way to apply a knowledge mobilisation approach within projects can be through introducing a midway dissemination meeting or session. This is something I did on a project where the initial findings of the project were presented by the research team in the morning, and then to facilitate knowledge mobilisation, these were discussed and debated at a round table with the stakeholders in the afternoon. It was a large meeting of 50 people, and stakeholders discussed with the research team what they felt that the key questions of the findings should be and how they thought they could be incorporated into practice. An additional aspect of the event was a chance to build relationships with these key stakeholders. And some of these relationships have continued to support this research team for follow-on projects. One important note is it doesn't have to be this large to have a meeting with stakeholders. I've been to very effective ones with 8 to 10 people, and some of my best conversations have actually been one-to-one. So how do you go about planning for KM? What should you consider? So we're now going to take you through 3 key steps that can start you planning your own knowledge mobilisation strategy. Firstly, we'd suggest it's really important to identify who your researchers are, or the communities who are going to use your research. Next, what are the contextual influences that will affect the use of your research? These can be the wider environmental, political, social, technological, legal, or economic contexts that could affect your stakeholders using your research. And finally, what tools do you have or need to connect and share knowledge? What do you have at your disposal? So identifying your stakeholders is a really good starting point. Do you know who's going to be understanding your research and who might be interested in it? If you already hold an NIHR personal project award, you might have already started this process, particularly by working with public advisors or key clinicians. So potentially everyone could be involved with your research. So how do you prioritize? How do you prioritize your time and energy and avoid wasting other people's time? It might not be as key. So to help you identify your key stakeholders, it can be helpful to consider these 2 questions. Who could or should be interested in your research or affected by your research and findings? And how much influence do they have on whether those research findings are adopted into practice? And we would suggest that a good way of approaching this is to then map the answer to those questions. And this really can help you to understand where you can focus your efforts and your resources. It's also very important to ensure you have diversity within that stakeholder group. So here on the diagram, you can see that the key stakeholders have the high interest and high influence. So this is an example of a project that I worked on for a study which involved models of care for general practitioners in the emergency department. And our main priority group was commissioners, because they were very interested in the results of the study, and they had a lot of influence because they were the ones who would decide whether new services or different services would be paid for. Patients also had a lot of interest in what care might be offered to them in emergency departments, but because they weren't directly paying for it, they had less influence on whether things were adopted into practice. And the GPs had an interesting role because they had a lot of influence over whether these models would be successful or not, because only if the general practitioners were prepared to move from primary to secondary care could these models go ahead. However, most of their focus was really on primary care where they were based. And it was only really the secondary care GPs who were most interested in this study. So they had a lot of influence, but as a professional body, were not as interested as a group. So it's also important to remember that the interest and influence of stakeholders can change over time. Stakeholders changing their interest or influence in your study is often due to a change of context. And we'll come on to that now. So by context, we mean a set of characteristics or circumstances that surround the mobilisation of your research. So this might be something you're fully aware of because you've practiced or worked in this area for a long time. However, sometimes the research context can straddle areas you're less aware of, for example, commissioning or policy making. And one way to start to think about and tackle this is to work through this process as we've highlighted here. So this is just a suggestion, but it's really to get you thinking on what sort of things might influence whether your research is adopted into practice. And bearing in mind the learning from the diffusion of innovation theory on the important influence and context in the adoption of new things, it really is worth spending some time thinking this through. So here we've got a Pestle chart. And the areas we would suggest to consider, and they might not all be appropriate, but just to think through the political, the environmental, the social, the technological, legal, and/or economic context. And it can also help in your thinking if you actually start to think through what may influence or impact in each of these areas. So Shreenan and colleagues suggest conducting a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Often strengths and weaknesses are actually the internal stuff to your project, your research team, your resources, skills, limit to knowledge, whereas opportunities and threats could be external factors such as timing and competitors. You may not have an answer to all these questions, but considering these aspects is really helpful. And you do need to bear in mind these may well change as your project progresses. And then the final area we would suggest is worth thinking through and considering is how best to communicate with the people, your priority audience, and your wider stakeholder groups. So if you take from your stakeholder mapping activity and start to think about how you're going to communicate and contact with these groups. And there's various channels of communication, but it's worth thinking about these three basic areas. So if you've got good networks and you're already involved in that area and you've perhaps a clinician working in practice, you can go direct to your key stakeholders. You've got the contacts and you've got the communication channels. If you're not so connected and perhaps it's a group you don't know very well, you might choose to identify an intermediary. Now, this could be a colleague who works in the area, or you might want to get in touch with a knowledge broker, or you might have another network contact from another area who might be able to help you. And the third channel we would suggest is through communities. So one way of doing it is to actually contact a professional body or a community group to put you in touch with a whole body of people who are in that area if you don't already have existing connections. And this is just a quick reminder that when you are speaking to stakeholders, it's really important to remember that as academics, we use quite a traditional format when we're communicating. But for everybody else, they tend to do it the other way around. So with an academic audience, we tend to come to the importance, the punchline right at the end. But for people who are not academic, it's much more important to know why they should engage, what's the relevance for them. And so switching the format around can be really helpful. And of course, do always remember to use appropriate language for the audience. And so there's lots of channels of communication that could be useful and all have pros and cons. Research in the area has indicated that some mechanisms are more or less effective depending on your stakeholder group. So for example, work with policymakers and commissioners has consistently shown that interactions with researchers are really the most effective for increasing the use of evidence. And one example is events. They can be organised throughout the research programme, as I gave you an example earlier. They come in different formats, policy labs, virtual roundtables, and it's a really good way of getting stakeholders to have an early sight of your research, to get on board and possibly become one of those champions you need to get it out there. It's a good way to get buy-in and to extend your network and involve those stakeholders. But it can be time-consuming to organise, and you can end up having a lot of people that preaching to the converted, essentially. However, if those are your champions, that could be really useful. So engaging directly with stakeholders can be really daunting, but it can provide rich information that can enable you to think through the value of your research in practice. Stakeholders can see your project and findings in a way you just might not have considered, and you may have a lot more to offer than you first realise. The importance of reciprocity is now outlined by Jenny Lynch in our next clip. Jenny is a knowledge mobilisation fellow working in social care who's been exploring through her fellowship how to introduce technology effectively within this environment. And here's Jenny explaining about the importance of reciprocity.
Having a KM role is really about reciprocity and trust. You have to think about yourself and what you are bringing to the party. What is it that you are bringing that can help to influence the implementation process, but help those colleagues that are actually, in practice doing the work. So for KM to work well, you want to be a trusted part of the conversation. So you want to be helping your colleagues to think through the challenges and opportunities. So think about your unique skill set. your point of view, where you're coming from, your academic background, as well as your sort of, you know, clinical or practice-based background, and what perspective that brings and how that can help in moving the project forward.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So as you've seen, there are lots of things that you can do to help effectively mobilize the knowledge which you gain from your research. However, even though these strategies are straightforward, there are some things that could pose potential challenges to your plans. And if possible, you should try and consider these at the outset. One of the key ones is the resources that are available. And this includes time, finances, and skills, both your resources, time and skills, and that of your research team. If you're applying for research funding at the moment, it's important that you include sufficient time and resources for knowledge mobilisation within your upcoming application. If you already have funding and you haven't allowed sufficient time and funds to deliver a robust knowledge mobilisation strategy, and some of the examples that we've given you do have costs associated to them, which cannot be perhaps retrieved from other aspects of a research budget or dissemination budget. However, the NIHR do have some funding for knowledge mobilisation that can be applied for at the end of projects or programmes of research. And it's worth exploring the opportunities to gain additional funds for these activities. Alternatively, you could consider working with your local applied research collaboration, which has a remit to support dissemination and knowledge mobilisation. So what we'd like to do now is just gauge how confident you feel about using some of the approaches that we've described in your research. And we'd like to launch a second poll and ask you to respond to this now. Okay. Okay, so just a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Okay, thank you. So we'll end the poll now. And I can see that, great, thank you. Okay, so apologies for the moving backwards and forwards with slides. So I can see that actually some of you, or many of you, are actually quite confident in applying some of these quite straightforward strategies that we've actually outlined to you today. But that others of you still feel a little unsure, a little concerned about how you might implement them into your research. And so we're aware that this is an introductory webinar. This is just to provide you with some basic and some easily applied strategies, but there are some additional resources that you can draw on to build on your skills and knowledge base to perhaps expand how you might integrate knowledge mobilisation into your research and also increase your confidence. So just thinking about some of the resources that are available, the Centre for Engagement and Dissemination has a remit to support knowledge mobilisation, and the contact details for both Helen and myself are on the final slide of this slide deck, which will be available to you all. There are also some resources available on the NIHR Open Learn platform and also the NIHR Evidence website. Other resources that are available is from the Knowledge Mobilisation Alliance. This is a group of researchers and clinicians funded through the NIHR Knowledge Mobilisation Fellowship Scheme, and they can be contactable via their website, and the address is on the slide, and they can provide information and support for anybody who's interested in more information about knowledge mobilisation. Another resource we'd recommend is a recently published book by Tara Lamont called Making Healthcare Matter: Steps to Impact for Healthcare Researchers. This is an easy read, accessible text, and it provides some additional useful advice for people interested in applying knowledge mobilisation strategies. And this can be downloaded from Bristol University Press. There are also a number of other websites that are freely available, and you can look at those and register to receive information and engage in some of the activities and toolkits which they provide for people who've registered. And we've listed a couple of those websites on the screen now for you to access in your own time. So we're drawing the presentation to a close now, and in summary, we have shown you what knowledge mobilisation is, and clarified, we hope, how you would define knowledge mobilisation and how it differs from dissemination and impact. Hopefully, we've provided some information of strategies that can be applied throughout the research cycle, and highlighted 3 very simple aspects that you can start to think about today to include in your own research. And that is the importance of engaging widely with your stakeholders and identifying your priority stakeholders to focus your effort, understanding how best to communicate with your priority stakeholders, and also really understanding the context that your research will be used in. We've provided a list of references for you as well. These are all the texts that we use to develop the content of this webinar today, and that's available for you. And then I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the NIHR Knowledge Mobilisation Research Fellows, Joe Langley, Jenny Lynch and Kate Beckett, who generously shared their insights into their knowledge mobilisation work. And I'm now going to hand back to Martine.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Lindsay and Helen, for that really interesting session. So we're now going to go through to the Q&A section that we have. And just a reminder that you still have time to pop your questions in. It's great to see we've got quite a few questions already. So I'm going to start off with the first question then. So what we've got here, and just remember you can upvote for your questions by clicking on the thumb little icon that you see there as well, so we can get through as many as we can. Okay, so the first one. So what one strategy would you apply to an ongoing research project if you had limited resources? So who would like to pick that one up? Thank you.
Shall I take that one, Helen? Because you're muted, yeah. Thanks very much, Martine. A great question. Thank you very much. So I think one of the most important, for me anyway, strategy to complete is a comprehensive stakeholder analysis. If you've only got very limited resources, you really need to target your funding, your time and your efforts to engage effectively with those key stakeholders. Although I would like to point out, it is important to engage with a diverse range of stakeholders within that target group. So that would be the one strategy that I would think was important and also quite straightforward to do. Thank you, Helen.
Okay, great.
Helen, you're on mute.
Okay, Yes,
Helen, you're currently muted. Perhaps I'll take another question and then perhaps Helen can join us.
Yeah. Okay, right then. So the next question is, so what would be your top tip for people new to knowledge mobilisation?
Ooh. Well, I think Jenny highlighted a really great top tip about understanding the aspect of reciprocity and making sure that you understand what you can give back to stakeholders as well. I think my top tip would be to start small. If you may have limited resources, but if you're new to knowledge mobilisation, then if you start with some small changes, I think Helen mentioned in her presentation that sometimes the most effective knowledge mobilisation strategies are those one-to-one conversations. And so that would be certainly something that I would think people could start today, starting small, and then building up your confidence in how to engage with your stakeholders. So that would be certainly my top tip. And perhaps, Helen, I don't know whether you can unmute now and perhaps contribute. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, at last, sorry. Could you repeat the question? I'm a bit flustered now from that. What was the question?
Top tip.
Yes.
Oh, top tip. Yes. So, yeah, I don't know if Lindsay covered this, but I would start small. And I think you only need one influential individual to really get things going. I've found champions are make a huge difference, as I outlined in the presentation. So that would be my top tip. You know, go with the fertile ground.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Right, are you ready for your next question? So we have quite a lot of people indicated this one too. Do you think that the shift to more online interactions and meetings has helped or hindered knowledge mobilisation?
Should I answer that? So I think it's given opportunities. So for example, it's easy to speak to people across the world now, which was very difficult before. So online communication has opened up all sorts of opportunities. But I think what we have lost is some of the richness of presence within the conversations that you have when you are with someone. So in the research I've been conducting, it's been much easier to meet with people, but the really rich conversations that you have when you are physically with somebody is lost. And I am quite a big advocate of face-to-face relationship building and personal contact.
And if I could just add, I think like anything, it's got pros and cons. And I think we do have to be mindful of digital exclusion as well. That there are some people who are either unable to access digital forums or to use them effectively. So I think there is some benefits to that. And I think it has enabled widespread stakeholder engagement, but there are some caveats to that.
Okay, right. And the next one, how would you cost in or outline knowledge mobilisation plans in grant proposals when structured suggests headings such as dissemination and word limits is very limited?
Yeah, Helen, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm all right. Great. Sorry about this. So some people advocate that knowledge mobilisation and dissemination should be about 10% of your overall grant. Although, you know, in practice, I know that's just not what happens, and it's a real struggle. And I've had budgets cut massively. So I think you put in what you can, and then you obviously have to work with what you've got. And I think, you know, there are some low cost dissemination strategies. We've been exploring the use of social media at the centre, and some of my colleagues have had the tweet chats and mobilising knowledge in that way. So, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of work to do to build up the importance of knowledge mobilisation, dissemination in the research process. But I think we all have to work with what we've got and make the most of that.
If I could just add to that, I think the NIHR has got an increasing recognition of the importance of dissemination and knowledge mobilisation. And if you can put forward a well-justified plan that's appropriately costed, then the panels will accept that and do understand that that's an important part, and possibly a part that's previously not had the attention that it deserved. And there is a change in emphasis now. The Centre for Engagement and Dissemination was launched in April 2020, and that's part of our remit, is to kind of roll out understanding of how important dissemination and knowledge mobilisation is as part of the research cycle. So I think it's important to have a well-justified plan, and I appreciate that word limits and funding ceilings can be a problem, but I would encourage you to think very carefully and plan, put forward a detailed plan if there's the space, and then cost it appropriately. And I would encourage you not to undercost it. Things like Kate's Forum Theatre or Joe's Collective Making, they require resources to do that properly and effectively. And I think the NIHR recognises that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, next one. So which NIHR grants funding is available for knowledge mobilisation after research has been completed?
Yep. So the HTA panel has some additional funding, and programme development grants have additional research, can be applied for knowledge mobilisation as well. So those are two discrete pots of funding. There is also a knowledge mobilisation stream to the advanced fellowship as well that you can apply for. And I would also encourage people to go back to the funding stream that you got your original funding from to inquire if they have any additional resources and whether you can apply for follow-on funding.
On you, there was just a second little bit to that question, and it was about whether you can share any names of awards.
Yeah, we can put together some resources. So the CED looks after the NIHR evidence website, and we're going to be building a knowledge mobilisation hub, and the names of those awards that currently have dedicated funding streams for knowledge mobilisation will be included on that hub as well.
Fabulous. And then we have requests for more advanced webinars. Will they be available?
So at the moment, we haven't got anything planned, because this is the first time the NIHR has kind of supported any kind of knowledge mobilisation webinar, and we weren't quite sure of the enthusiasm and the interest in it. And we very much pitched this as an introductory session for people who had little or no experience or understanding of what the term meant. We have been delighted and surprised by the level of enthusiasm and engagement with this webinar, and that's certainly something that we can look at developing, if you like, the next steps, and perhaps showcase some more of the innovative, complex forms of knowledge mobilisation, that there are strategies that there are available, and that's something we'd be happy to do.
And could I just add, if anyone wants to give us any feedback on the next sort of webinar and the information that they would like in knowledge mobilisation, that would be really helpful, so we can target it to what people would like.
Lovely, thank you. So they were the most popular ones, and there's still quite a few. So I'm just going to start from the top and work down. So do knowledge transfer, exchange, mobilisation and translation all mean the same thing?
They mean slightly different things. Which is why we've moved to the term of knowledge mobilisation, but they're all very much in the same area, and I think they're all trying to address this research practice gap which we've been outlining. I mean, I'd be very happy to discuss that on, offline. That's quite a lengthy explanation, to be honest.
I think the key thing is that the terms are used interchangeably when they do have slightly different definitions. And that's why we wanted to be quite clear about what we were going to be talking about today, and to distinguish between knowledge mobilization, dissemination, impact, and to really define what we meant by that.
Okay, and this is a similar question again, just asking for some definition, and that will be between knowledge mobilization, dissemination, and implementation. What's the difference?
So I think Lindsay has covered the difference between knowledge mobilization and dissemination. So we would say that knowledge mobilization is more than dissemination because it's a two-way process. I don't know whether this is really about implementation science, which is very much, I think I mentioned earlier, is very much akin to knowledge mobilization, and has slightly different methods, but we're all very much working in the same space. There's a paper coming out shortly that's really getting to the nuts and bolts of that, and that's going to be authored by Fiona Cowdell. And I think that really goes into that, and I'd be happy to share with anyone that publication when it's available.
So implementation is about that actually you need to mobilize the knowledge to get people to understand what the research means and to create new knowledge by sharing with the research users. And then implementation is the actual process of putting it into practice. So perhaps slightly further down the line than knowledge mobilization. But as Helen said, there are lots of overlapping aspects to both knowledge mobilization and implementation. And you can refer back to the earlier definitions that we gave about dissemination and knowledge mobilization.
Great, thank you. And a question here then is how can we mobilize knowledge to the public cohort participants without scaremongering on any potential findings of the detrimental health?
So I think that speaks to the aspect of communication, really. It's important to think about how you shape your message and to work with your stakeholder group to understand how best to shape that message for the communities that you're going to be sharing it with, including negative findings or communicating risk and some negative consequences. And so that's why working with your stakeholder group to really understand how to shape the message effectively in a way that's sympathetic and empathetically done, and to work with them to shape that message. Yeah. There's quite a lot of research on communicating risk and some of other negative consequences, which is available to be drawn upon to help you as well.
And if I could just add, I think in that situation, it really does speak to the value of mobilizing knowledge with your stakeholder groups and public contributors, so you can really understand how those messages may be interpreted, and you can work together to make sure your message is shaped in a way that it's effective and not frightening.
Okay, so and the question here is, I'm interested in the midway knowledge mobilization event idea. Can you say a bit more about the benefits of doing a midway in a project? I've always done this work at the end of a project when the findings were finalized.
Yeah, so it's a really great thing to do. It sits very well with some projects where you may have some initial findings, particularly some of the projects I've worked on where we've completed perhaps the first stage of the work plan and we know some interesting things, and it's an opportunity then to share that with practitioners and stakeholders, and just check in with them that you're on the right track, and that they're often very, very interested in those early stage findings. However, you do have to be quite careful how you do it. So I remember at our stakeholder event, we had to ask everyone not to take photographs of the slides because the findings weren't quite crystallized yet. But it really is a great way to form those early relationships and have an understanding of where your research may go, and that knowledge is very much held by your stakeholders, and and can really change your thinking around your research.
Okay. Yeah. And we have one here. It's social interaction is so important for knowledge mobilisation. How has the COVID pandemic affected knowledge mobilisation?
Well, I think it kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier. So social interaction can be done online. It's different. There have been a lot of opportunities that have opened up with everyone becoming very able to use technology. You can have large meetings, you can have meetings with people across the world, you know, everyone can be there, which is great. But I mean, one of the things I've noticed, you know, I normally work in a commissioning organisation whereby I have informal conversations with people as I walk through the office. Obviously, the pandemic has made that very, very difficult. And I know other knowledge brokers who've been struggling in the same way. So there's been opportunities and threats, I guess, as we were saying earlier.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's changed it rather than necessarily stunted it or hindered it, which is potentially where that question was coming from. For example, we know of communities of practice which have been established and have literally just transferred their working online very successfully. So it's changed the format, but it hasn't actually changed the opportunity to mobilise knowledge.
Thank you. So we do have a few more questions. I'm just mindful of time. Have you got time for maybe a couple more? Yep. So we've got one here. It's what is the best way of tracking large-scale knowledge mobilisation?
Tracking it, as in recording it. Doing it.
That's the unless anyone wants to add in the chat if who answered that question or who asked.
So one of the ways that we have recorded knowledge mobilisation opportunities on the informal basis is basically through reflective diaries, where we've been because a lot of the social interaction is informal, it's ad hoc, it's opportunistic, and it's worth, if you want to then remember where those knowledge sharing opportunities came from and what they produced. A lot of researchers actually keep a reflective diary as one means of doing it. There are others, but that's a basic way of making a start on that. Lindsay, have you got anything to add?
No, I'm not sure we've actually understood the question correctly, but if we haven't, then please email us and we can perhaps engage in a more specific dialogue, because there's also some information around evaluating knowledge mobilisation strategies as well, which is what you might be asking. We haven't got time to go into that now, but please do reach out and contact us if we haven't quite grasped the point of your question.
And there's just the one more, but it was more of a statement rather than a question. It says it hasn't been mentioned that in many research units or centres, there are knowledge mobilisation leads who can help signpost and provide support. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely.
And we would encourage everyone to connect with their knowledge mobilisation leads, of course.
So we mentioned that the ARCS is a great organisation to engage with, but also the HPRUs have got knowledge mobilisation leads, and many other organisations, you know, governments have them, etc. So it really depends on the context that you're working in, and once you've identified that and really understood that, then you can then reach out to people within that organisation that can help you to mobilise your research.
Okay. Right, so I think we've just about covered all the questions. So unless there's anything you'd like to add again, Lindsay and Helen, shall I close the session? Yep, thank you. So thanks again, Lindsay and Helen. Hopefully everyone has found this webinar beneficial and feels able to apply some of these techniques in their own research. So as mentioned at the start of the webinar, for those of you joining us live, as we close the session, you will be asked to complete a quick evaluation form. The link is also available now in the chat. You may have noticed further up, I can tell that we've had some some statements put in the chat, so you might find that's a little bit further. So this will give us an opportunity to share your email address so that we can receive a copy of the slides, or you can receive a copy of the slides. And if you have the time, please do provide us with your feedback, because this is greatly appreciated. All our past webinars can be found on our NIHR TV YouTube channel under the Development and Support Webinars playlist. You can also find a link in the chat box for the NIHR offers of programs online, particularly our workshops and webinars to support you as a leader and also your digital engagement skills. And you'll also find that in the chat. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed this session and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you very much to Lindsay and Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you.